Thank you to so many wonderful people I have met over the course of today and yesterday. I'm just really delighted to be here and to meet you all and to just sort of to see your level of interest in this topic and in this larger context. Being German myself, working on the Pacific and liking wine, I think I fit right in. And in other ways, I may not. I'm not a storyteller per se, so instead I will sort of zoom out a little bit and sort of provide some other context or some other perspectives from Japan. I'm also not basing my comments on my own research per se, because this is not what I do. But I do teach on it. I teach a research seminar on Hiroshima and history and memory at the moment. But my own research is post-war Japan. It's really memory, in memory of the war. And right now I really work on war crimes trials, the Allied war crimes trials, or rather the aftermath of the war crimes trials, both in Asia and in Europe. So this is a global approach. Shock and awe in Japan, trauma between science and politics. I think we are all at the age, well, all minus our students, who might remember the fiasco in 1995 when the Smithsonian was supposed to exhibit the fuselage of the Enola Gay. And I think the Smithsonian had commissioned a whole bunch of artifacts from the Hiroshima Peace Museum, and it just couldn't be shown in America, which really, I don't know, that really was an aha moment in my study of memory, that it was so impossible politically to make this happen. It is, in many ways, also at that time, 1996 actually, is when that term shock and awe was coined. So it is in many ways ahistorical to use that to refer back to 45. And it was really used in the 2003 Iraq War. But nonetheless, I think most of us see shock and awe as, or see the atomic bomb as the example of that kind of a strategy. So allow me to play with that term a little bit today and use it a bit differently with respect to Japan. What you see here is a conventional binary that is very tempting for me to go into. So the binary or the opposition between the atomic bomb and the view from above, the atypical American view of the mushroom cloud, and then on the other side, the Japanese view of what happened below the cloud, the view that is so often ignored or downplayed or simply just not mentioned in America. And in many ways, you don't have, or we don't have photographs of what happened right underneath the mushroom cloud, but we have lots of artistic renditions of what people experienced. In this case, the just really absurd, grotesque melting of the flesh from the bones that nobody had experienced before, of course. So it is tempting for me to show you that side, but I've decided not to, because in many ways I would like to move that perspective away from the American and the Japanese kind of view of things, and instead to focus on science. And Dr. Nolan has beautifully introduced this already by mentioning the close collaboration between American and Japanese scientists. And to draw an arc here from atomic nuclear research for atomic weapons and those for nuclear energy, for nuclear reactors. And to give you a little bit of a sense of the perhaps counterintuitive fact that the Japanese, of all, adopted nuclear energy very fast. And the first nuclear reactor in Japan was built in Hiroshima. I mean, that fact alone of selling the Japanese on nuclear energy within the first 10 years is something. And interestingly, we really, in Japanese history, have not dealt with this very much at all until Fukushima, 2011, the tsunami and then the meltdown of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And everybody was like going, wait, what? Why does Japan have so many nuclear reactors? And so on, right? Yes, not a lot of natural resources in Japan, and it's an amazing energy source, no doubt. And yet, how did this happen? So those questions are, relatively new for us, and I wanted to speak to this a little bit more. And yet, I think at least one step back is warranted to make the point about science and politics, because science is so closely entangled and related with empire. And that is not only Japan, but every single of the modern powers, including the United States. And in this case, not only empire, but also war, and in particular, the arms race of the early 1940s. And there was an arms race going on everywhere, and people were sharing or stealing from each other information, technological, scientific information. The Germans were a great resource, both for nuclear science and also for bacteriological and chemical weapon science. And the Japanese also availed themselves of that. And just to say that, as was already mentioned, Japan itself had a nuclear program during the war. They didn't quite have the resources to really take it further in the way that really only the US was able to at the time. But when we're talking about an arms race, Japan lost that one, but it clearly won the arms race on bacteriological weapons warfare. Every major country had such a program, including the United States. So what I'm showing you here is just another one, kind of a different type of a binary here, but that is more not an opposition, but rather a parallelity of Americans winning on the nuclear front and the Japanese having won on the bacteriological front. And Unit 731 in Manchuria is sort of the most outrageous of those places where research was done. And you can, if you do research on human subjects, you usually get to your results a little faster. After the war, when the US and many other powers started war crimes trials, and that's more my area of research, the US military secretly bought Japan's data for bacteriological weapons and used it to enhance its own weapons program and so-called, in certain ways, catch up to the enemy. And instead of putting probably Japan's worst war criminals, Dr. Ishii and others in Manchuria, on trial for war crimes, instead they outfitted them with new identities and made it possible for them to restart their careers as new people in Japan. So even though that doesn't pertain to the Manhattan Project very closely, I would like us to keep in mind those kinds of machinations at the same time as we are talking now, very early after the war. So in rethinking shock and awe, and I just, maybe I want to go back when there was one more thing I wanted to say about the nuclear and the chemical weapons. Obviously, the nuclear weapons really did go off with a big bang. So shock and awe, is this decisive blow, right? And then supposedly it's over, except, of course, it isn't, but still, it's that bang. Bacteriological weapons don't work that way, right? They're clandestine, they're secret, you don't really know where the plague is really coming from, and so on. So it is not the showy kind of research. So let's go back to shock and awe. And I'd like to show a couple of other sort of binaries or oppositions that I think kind of come together in ways that we don't usually think about them, and are in some ways cross-cutting. So one thing is to think of shock and awe not as only this one decisive blow, and then it's over, but rather as a longer process of managing shock through awe in the framing stages of the nuclear age. And awe being both political in terms of political power, but especially awe in terms of science. Another way to think about it is more geographically. And I'm really, by the way, really happy the way that our program today moved geographically, in very specific and explicit ways, from Oak Ridge to Los Alamos, and then making, getting on the plane, getting to Tinian Island and arriving in Hiroshima. And now I will remain in Japan. But I wanted to point out that the shock of the atomic bombing remained largely local in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Neither Americans nor the Japanese government had an interest in making this widely, publicly available. In fact, while Americans had read in John Hersey's accounts in 1946 about what happened, the Japanese populace didn't. And the very first time the Japanese got to see photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in 1952. That says something about how memory develops when you have such a gap. I'm not claiming that nobody didn't know anything. I mean, not to that extent. But I think there is an important piece about the shock having remained largely local and the responsibility for dealing with what was happening in these two cities remained local. The Japanese government was not at all involved in this. But the awe of science and of power was global. And it did have to do with the elites, both of America and Japan. It also had to do with the sort of globalness of science itself and the scientists who work together in different ways. So what's left out? The national. So I'm proposing that we take the national, sort of with brackets and work with that carefully. It's, I think, in many ways misleading to think about this whole history in national terms. And I'm very happy to say that we really haven't done that so much today. Also, going with the local versus the global, the shock remained largely with the victims, and the awe with the scientists and the politicians, and also with national publics. So here the nation does come in, and I will return to that. But what I mean by that is something that sort of became clear to me only recently when I went back to this particular history, coming from my own perspective of working on the war crimes trials, this was a time, the 1940s, the late 40s, the 50s, I mean, this really goes on, but especially this early post-war time was really a time when we were obsessed with perpetrators or with the people in power who made certain decisions, and not with the victims. The Holocaust victims also did not matter much. That might come as a surprise because we think so differently today. And sure, there was a Geneva Convention in 1949 that hammered out some human rights legislation globally. But when you really think about how the aftermath of World War II was dealt with, the victims had almost no voice. And it wasn't about them. And compensation, reparations, redress was absolutely nowhere to be seen. In terms of how memory changed over the post-war period, that part really changed in the 80s and then in the 90s, that we really looked at victims. Yes, Holocaust victims were, got a voice earlier, no doubt, and the founding of Israel, of course, was a big part of that as well. But still, it was, small steps. And in terms of legislation and laws that allowed us to really work with that population, that was not until the late 80s, early 90s. And, that has its own particular context. But I just wanted to point that out, that the kind of neglect of Hiroshima victims is something that is sort of in line with something much larger and much more global. But the big context that needs to be mentioned here and that we need to take into consideration in Japan is this immense reframing of the US-Japan relationship from an enmity that was really hatred. And I'm sure you know John Dower's work on War Without Mercy. It really was without mercy. That kind of, and the ways in which I think the American military took at face value some of the Japanese propaganda about, the Japanese martial spirit and all of that, and the divinity of the emperor and so on. Few Japanese actually believed that as much as Americans did. So from their perspective, in terms of propaganda, it worked rather well. So how do you change relatively quickly from that kind of enmity to a situation where the US military occupies Japan and is responsible for getting Japan back on its feet? From utmost physical destruction, all 67 major cities in Japan were firebombed, to dealing with hunger, to dealing with all the reforms that Americans had in mind for political reform, and I don't think it was so much for Japan's benefit. There were lots of people, I think New Dealers, who had very optimistic and idealistic ideas. But in many ways, Japan was absolutely crucial to the emerging American empire at that time. So making alliance was the sort of the power situation that emerged bit by bit by bit within the Cold War, right? And because of it as well. So let me just give you a couple of, or one small example in terms of awe as politics. And to do that, to give you a sense of how Japanese and Americans actually collaborated on the elite level, maybe even colluded in creating something that both sides could live with very well. Here's an example, Yoshi Igarashi's argument, that everybody could agree on kind of the awe of great men making big decisions. And so here's Truman making the decision to explode the bomb, and as Americans always say to this day, which saved millions of lives and ended the war, one wonders why we don't use it more often, right? If it saves lives and ends wars, and rescues Japan from itself. But on the Japanese side, you kind of have a dovetailing narrative invented at that same time, and that had everything to do with Emperor Hirohito. Hirohito's divine intervention to surrender, that ended Japanese suffering. And the acceptance, Japan's acceptance of the US as a superior power, making Japan a good loser. As Yoshida Shigeru once said, we may have lost the war, but we won the peace. So that kind of dovetailing of two narratives from in both sides that really kind of were complementary rather than than different, but was really based on sort of the awe of great men making big decisions. Now, the real collaboration during the occupation was not Truman, of course, but General MacArthur, SCAP, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. Here, visible with Emperor Hirohito, who had come down from the heavens and had actually become a man. This very famous image is called the wedding picture. When the Japanese government found out that the Asahi Shimbun was going to print it, they did everything they could to pull it back, but it was already too late. And to sort of see how both sides, this is another argument for that kind of dovetailing, the kinds of contradictions that emerged in this kind of collaboration. So on the American occupation side here, imposing peace at gunpoint and imposing democracy from above, when we all know that democracy has to, grow from the roots, and to do all of this and teach freedom of speech through censorship. So these kinds of contradictions make a difference, right, in the ways in which Japanese could understand what was going on. Nothing was as censored in post-war Japan as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombing. Lots of other things were censored, but that was completely off limit. On the Japanese side, the emperor became the people's emperor. And the idea in a democracy that everybody is equal made all Japanese equal, and it also made all war victims equal. The idea here is that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims, or called hibakusha in Japanese, were not different from anybody else who had been victimized in any other part of Japan or the empire. And both sides really hung on to this, that neither the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nor the victims of an atomic bomb versus other kinds of catastrophes, were going to be treated any different. That had huge implications. Of course, and this was also mentioned when you look at these pictures, this was America's view of things. Well, you look on the left side, that's firebomb Tokyo. On the right side, it's nuked Hiroshima. Same difference. As we know, not same difference, right? And the black rain, radioactive ash that rained on the victims in the days after, of course, the radiation makes the big difference. So I do want to show you, I do want to sort of, put this in, even though it's not my focus today, of the grotesqueness of that experience, the fact that it was very much not the same as being firebombed. Picadon is the term that Japanese invented for the experience of the bomb. Pika, meaning pika pika is, it's a flash, and don as the big blow that you hear. So it's an onomatopoeia. And you see here some of the newness of what people experienced. So one is that everybody was like walking with their hands in front of them because the flesh melting off of their hands, but also just eyeballs melting out of their sockets. People desperately thirsty and screaming for water, please give me water. And people would, there's 7 rivers in Hiroshima, and people would want to help them and give them water. They would drink the water and basically keel over because, of course, the water was highly, highly radioactive. So it's completely unprecedented experience. Picadon here is the first collection of pictures drawn, and you have the mother and the child, and this kind of grotesque experience of, dead mothers suckling their babies, or the dead baby suckling on an alive mother. I mean, it just kind of, that's sort of the symbol, right, for what's really, really wrong. So this is real, but it remained local, was my point. And this collaboration and the making of narratives, between different elites, whether it's scientists, Americans, Japanese, on all these different levels, happens in many ways with the victims in their own, not so much left out, but in their own kind of sphere. A big argument has been the active collusion between elites in Japan and in America, and by that I mean conservative elites. One name particularly important here is Shoriki Matsutaro, who was a highly conservative politician, owner of the Yomiuri Shimbun, owner also of the Yomiuri Giants, kind of the founder of the Japanese baseball world, and so on, collaborating closely with American conservatives to really get that whole story of victims suppressed, and instead advocate for nuclear energy. And for a long time, we've kind of seen Shoriki Matsutaro was also a war criminal, and so I encountered him in Sugamo, the American prison of war criminals, but then was released. And this kind of collaboration of American interests with Japanese conservative interests is a real story here. But more recent research really shows that all the main public newspapers, the 3 big ones, is the Asahi Shimbun, which is a liberal paper, the Mainichi Shimbun, which is also liberal, and the Yomiuri, which is conservative to this day, that all 3 newspapers began publishing editorials as early as 1946, advocating for nuclear energy, for peaceful means, and trying to make the Japanese public understand that nuclear research can, yes, result in terrible weapons, and also be beneficial for all kinds of purposes, medical, energy, and so on. So the idea that only the super conservatives like Shoriki were responsible for some kind of, evil collusion with some Americans, that has really been debunked. Instead, we need to think about how it is that the Japanese public, through these newspaper editorials, were actually fed, for years before, years before Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech. The idea that nuclear energy is the future for Japan. And that, I think, is an interesting point. So science and politics, this goes back to the beginning of my talk. this infatuation with science. Science and an empire being absolutely necessary to be someone in the world, to become the modern country that Japan always wanted to be. And in many ways was. Japan was the most modern and technologically advanced country during the war. Then there was the dip after the war, but the know-how was there, right? The facilities were destroyed, but the know-how was there. And this, there was this, even the emperor could say that Japan was not defeated because of its, deficient spirit or deficient modernity, but rather because the Americans had won on the pure scientific front. So, what needed to be done? More science, right? So what really survived that 45 break is exactly that infatuation with science and technology to bring Japan, to make Japan modern, to bring Japan, into the world. And nuclear energy from the get-go became part of that. So the awe of that science piece was really what mitigated the shock, or what was meant to mitigate the shock of the catastrophe of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you can imagine how victims, were dealing with that kind of thing. But of course, their voices were not being asked for, and yet they came out. So I used the word trauma in my title, and I would like to bring it in here too, even though I'm not going to dwell upon it. But this movement towards embracing peace as a symbol and so on, and the way that the embrace of nuclear energy, how all of this worked in the early post-war period, I think has very much to do with ways of dealing with the trauma of what really happened. And I don't mean so much the victims only, but the whole possibility of what a nuclear age meant. So I used the word trauma rather deliberately, and I've done my own research on that, but to just suggest that trauma was present in so many different ways and on all sides. And I think Dr. Nolan has given us really wonderful examples of what kind of trauma was there on the American sides. And you will see that some collaborations on all kinds of levels, below the governmental level, between Americans and Japanese, on all kinds of sides, were invented and kind of played out under the radar screen to, work with that. I'd like to sort of make that clear in three different ways, or in three different, times or places, and to suggest that various shared interests came together to turn shock into awe. In the early post-war period, when it came to medical science, in just a few years later, in Hiroshima itself, and I'm now using Hiroshima to stand in for both cities, but Hiroshima really was at the forefront and maneuvered itself into a particular position at that time in 1949, and had everything to do with urban modernity and the opportunity of building a new city, a hyper-modern city from scratch. And then in the mid-50s, the Atoms for Peace initiatives, nuclear energy in the aftermath, or within the context of the third nuclear incident where Japanese got irradiated. Let's see. And the survivor witness in all of this had a dual role of both private silence and public testimony. How did this work? So these are different ways of trauma responses. Okay, let's see. Here we go. So, because we already talked about this in the last contribution, I will be very brief here. This is an American science team going in right after the bombings. There's a good book about this, Suffering Made Real, American scientists and, let's see, and the survivors in Hiroshima. And the author of this book talks about it as colonial science. So of the use of victims of the atomic bomb for pure data, not so different from what the Japanese did in Manchuria with Unit 731, using the lesser people, the colonial people, as subjects here. And at the same time, it's the local doctors who are confronted with the victims and with the unprecedented, with just the challenge of what the hell am I seeing and how should I be treating this? I'm happy to know that there was at least one doctor, maybe a couple more Americans who were interested in that. But it was policy that Americans would, under no circumstances, help victims, neither would the Japanese government. The second part really is, in some ways, more puzzling, and it goes to that question of how long was residual radiation in these cities. There was the saying that Hiroshima would be uninhabitable for 70 years, but pretty soon after, all kinds of things happen. So you have this completely destroyed area, nothing but ash, and the first irises would come up. That's the crazy iris. It's also the name of poetry. So the return of life actually happened, more quickly than anybody would have thought. And in any case, people in Hiroshima, this is now the local interest, were, incredibly interested in somehow figuring out ways to get money to rebuild and to help the homeless and so on. Here you have a land use plan of Hiroshima City in terms of zoning, how they imagined it, and at the very center, the way this was framed was in terms of sort of the bright flash, or the pika, right? The bright flash of peace. Capitalizing on the fact that Hiroshima was the first nuclear city, making that into a commemorative tourism, a way in which one could sell the place, and doing fundraising, what couldn't be done with the Japanese government, instead fundraising with Americans and with American civilians at home, so not American government. So a collaboration with local people in Hiroshima, local politicians, and Americans in getting money into it, and playing on the trauma of Americans who felt bad about what had happened there. So this is the first kind of funding way in which Hiroshima was able to get some money into rebuilding this place, and then in 1949 was able to convince the Diet, the Japanese Congress in Tokyo, to pass legislation for rebuilding Hiroshima. And they did this in some ways by collecting some of the artifacts that were still around. And these are the famous ones that are now in the Peace Museum that could not be shown in 1995 in the Smithsonian. The irradiated tricycle, the clock that stopped at exactly the time when the bomb exploded, or the irradiated lunchbox, suggesting, of course, that many, many children died, right? So those became the first artifacts. And again, on the Japanese side, just as on the American side, rather than looking at the people and helping them so much, it was artifacts, it was sites. It was a safer thing. And Rand Swigenberg has done very good work on this, on the city of Hiroshima and how that got rebuilt. And you can see here on the poster that's actually on the left, it's a famous poster for the first peace festival and the first peace declaration, No More Hiroshimas. And you can see the dome and behind it, the mushroom cloud. So that kind of the selling of the site in this way became a way to rebuild and to reclaim the city of Hiroshima. But here, again, to rebuild Hiroshima as the most modern city. So again, here comes the science. This is now urban structure, urban, and designing Hiroshima as a modern, new city in the American style with large boulevards, for example. You see Kenzo Tange, the architect, who was Japan's most famous architect, who designed many fascist buildings during the war, who also designed the famous stadium of the Tokyo Olympics of 1964. He gets to design the museum that would then house some of these artifacts, which you can see as a very modern building as well, and as well as the cenotaph. I don't know how easily visible this is, probably not, but when you look through that cenotaph, it's lined up directly with the dome, so you can see that through there. The green area here is where the Peace Park was being built, and the number 3, that's that bluish line, is a huge throughway that's called Peace Boulevard. So very American type of structure. But what I find really interesting is that the mayor of Hiroshima, Hamai Shinzo, made this famous statement: on August 6th, our city was born anew. Never mind that it vanished before, So that switch to a narrative that, now I remember what I wanted to say. The way to make this work, both with the American occupation and with the Japanese in general, was to put everything in peace terms, right? This is now the new peace age, from war to peace. This is the new peace city, the new peace festival, and so on. And with it, nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. In certain ways, this is a trauma response. So here you have that kind of switch from the irradiated, destroyed city to the new, flourishing city. Whereas the victims, pictures of which you see on the left, were in many ways left to the side and came out, differently later on. So in terms of trauma responses, what you have on the one side is a response of shame, of social ostracism, of silence amongst hibakusha, whose symptoms could not be really understood or interpreted. There was always talk about, whether they could have children, whether by marrying one, whether that would mean your own offspring would be disabled, and so on. And at the same time, pride, a certain pride, a national pride in time, of victims' consciousness through testimony. So that too became a big thing from the get-go, certain hibakusha really leaning into that. But peace is really the way in which all of this was framed. I need to go a little bit quicker now. One example of that kind of collaboration between Americans and Japanese on the kind of lower level was what now is called people's diplomacy. That was also happening between Japan and China at the time. And the project was the Hiroshima Maidens. This was a collaboration between a reverend in Hiroshima and a journalist, cousins, in the US. By which a number, I think 24 or so, young Japanese women who had been disfigured by the bomb were brought to New York, to Mount Sinai Hospital, where cosmetic surgery was much more advanced than in Japan, and were operated on. I think 1 or 2 died, but others benefited from them. So this kind of sign of goodwill on the lower level, on the civic level, even though the American government almost killed the project. I might go just a little bit over, because in many ways this wouldn't be complete, without the Bikini Island, the Bravo test on March 1st, 1954, a test that in some ways succeeded beyond measure in the sense that it was so much larger and the radiation fallout so much bigger than the military had let on. And while the American scientists, and it's actually not this test that they are watching in this photo, but I think it still makes the point. While American scientists are watching in their beach chairs, a Japanese fishing boat gets irradiated. One fisherman dies within a couple months. Everybody suffers from radiation because they were in the fallout zone and didn't know that because they were told otherwise. So now Japan is irradiated for the third time. And what comes out of this, I mean, many things change after that. This was actually the time, first they didn't report it for 2 weeks, so it was not until March 16th that the Japanese public was even told this had happened. And during that time, the Diet passed laws to found the Japanese National Energy Commission and for nuclear power. So all of this happens at the same time. What also happens is to deal with this incident in an imaginary way. This is the birth of Gojira, or Godzilla. Godzilla was from the get-go a nuclear monster. 2 years later, when that film came into American movie theaters, that monster had been cleaned up. There was no more nuclear issues connected to it. It was not until the early 2000s that American audience could even watch the original Japanese Gojira, which had everything to do with a nuclear monster rising out of the Pacific. And then it comes on land and breathes fire and destroys Tokyo. So this is the firebombing. So all of the war and the post-war and the dangers of the nuclear war, all kinds of are wrapped up into what is sold in this country as a really cheesy kind of stupid movie, but was actually highly relevant for Japanese at the time. At this time, too, this was really the impetus for civic organizing in big ways. So the anti-nuclear movement starts at this time. It actually starts with housewives getting together and signing petitions and sending them around, and then becomes a national movement. There are a couple of posters I put in here that were actually done by the same person who did the Picadon film, pictures book. And you see the peace doves, right? This is how you sell things through symbolism of peace. And also interesting is just all the children of the world, all these different cultures coming together in this. So this is the Japan Council Against A&H Bombs that gets born here. It gets politicized very quickly, unfortunately, but it's really a major movement that now is national. So at this point, you have kind of the movement out of the local together with the global, but at this point, a national movement of Japan as the victim of bombs, not just people in Hiroshima, but Japan being the victim. This is what happens at this time. And at the same time, the hibakusha, or the atomic bomb sufferers, they also are able to found their own national organization, Confederation of Bomb Sufferers, and are then able to press charges with the Japanese government for medical help. So it's at this point that the specialness, so to speak, of Hiroshima victims get recognized, and with it comes a nuclear modernity, and that is the Atoms for Peace project. That actually you have Atoms for Peace exhibits all over Japan, but in 1956 you have one in the Peace Park of Hiroshima, followed 2 years later by the Recovery Expo. So here you have the Atoms for Peace, a stamp here That's the original speech was in 1953, but the Japanese didn't have to be convinced yet, because convinced at this point, because the scientists had already been convinced, and with the help of the public media, this sort of had been building over these 10 years that people understood about it. The important point to understand here is that with this development, there was a deliberate dissociation of the bomb from nuclear energy. And with that also comes a deliberate dissociation of the data of radiation and everything around that, from nuclear weapons to that of reactors or nuclear energy. And that regime remained in place until relatively recently. That this kind of connection was not so much that people didn't make it, but that it was inconvenient to make it. So that comes out of this. This is just the expo at the very end. So my kind of way of playing with the idea of shock and awe within the political context of the US-Japan alliance, which was much more than just a colonial encounter and the Americans imposing everything on Japan, or even American conservatives and Japanese conservatives colluding on certain policies. It went all the way down, but not in easy ways, but in ways that moved over time, that developed over time. So I wanted to give you a little bit of that arc from 45 to the mid to late 50s here. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes, but if there's more questions, remember they will be joining us for a roundtable, so don't forget those. So do we have some hands, some questions? Virtual audience? Okay, we have a question over here. Please wait for the mic. She's on her way.
Just stand up.
When I worked at the Atomic Energy Commission, there was a repository in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where all of the contractors who worked at the various Atomic Energy Commission laboratories had to submit their research papers. And that library was open to the general public, well, worldwide. The biggest customer was Japan.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. But also because, the first scientists who did research were Japanese scientists. So before the ABCC was even founded, it was really as early as October 45, Japanese scientists were publishing papers, and the American occupation would come in and immediately censor it and put it away. And anything that they then published together was also, either censored or was, only certain things could be published. So of course the Japanese were, super interested. Yeah.
All right, there's a question in the back row behind the tables.
I was just curious about your thoughts on the American perspective towards nuclear energy and how it's, usually largely negative.
On American energy?
The American attitude towards using nuclear energy.
Nuclear energy. Well, we built, we were the first to build reactors, right? And I think, in the 80s, there was a big dip against it, 3 Mile Island and then Chernobyl and so on. I think Fukushima for a while, was a big one, actually was bigger in Europe and in Germany than elsewhere. And I think right now, in the age of climate change, I actually would say that nuclear energy is back up again. It seems cleaner. We just need to make sure that we make it safer. That was always the talk, right? That nuclear energy and nuclear reactors, are cleaner and are a better way. What we need to do is make it safe. And it is safe until it's not, right? And then there is the question of not not just the fallout, but of the spent fuel and of the waste. And that's what we are confronted with now. And it's a global thing. And the Pacific, again, is the graveyard of that waste. And with climate change, turns out that in the Marshall Islands, some of these sites are sort of coming to the surface again. And so this is a highly moving target, I would think.
All right, there's a question in this back corner.
Yes, I was wondering if in Japan today it is widely known that during the war, the Japanese had not one but 2 nuclear weapons programs, one for the Army, one for the Navy.
Say that, can you say that again? That they had, during the war, they had?
Yes. Is it widely known in Japan today, do they realize that during the war, the Japanese had 2 nuclear weapons programs, one run by the Army
and
one
by
by the Navy?
Yeah, programs. I heard weapons, and I couldn't quite make sense of it. So, weapons programs, yeah. I didn't really know that, but I'm also not a specialist. I'm sure that the specialists know this very well, Japanese historians who have, don't forget that, we all kind of decry that we don't have enough books and not enough research done on the Pacific War and so on. Well, in English we don't. There are other languages around, and the historians of the Pacific War are Japanese. They also have best access to documents. Even the Chinese acknowledge that the best historians of that war are Japanese. And for the most part, they are liberal historians who are very aware of what their country did. So I can't really answer that question, but I would suppose that they do know about that, especially because everybody knows that the Army and the Navy were competing entities in big ways and in terrible ways. Thank you for enlightening me.
All right, there's time for one more question, and I saw an arm pop up back there.
Yes, just like to hear your comment on a juxtaposition and cause, effect, and consequences. Japan and Germany. In Germany, they teach about World War II in schools to great detail and continue to do so. And to the point, even later current generations, know a lot about it, and there's kind of established a national guilt, which has also been transferred to some of the new German generations, to the point that emotionally the population is manipulated to accept things that are bad for Germany. However, in Japan, from what I didn't quite hear everything I don't hear well the last question, but in Japan, very little is taught in schools. They don't know a whole lot about it, and today there's an increasing trend of glorification of World War II. It's in their museums, and also they have a carrier right now named the Kaga, and that they're asking for compassion, but they seem to give very little, or they're too ignorant to give any to the millions of people that they caused to suffer. If I could hear your comment on that, please.
We can be here for another couple of days. That happens to be my research topic. So it's a big question. I think it's not well taken. Who are they? Is my first question to you. Not all Japanese think and feel the same. In Japan, memory does not get handled by the government for the most part, but by below government entities. Even the most nationalistic site in Japan, Yasukuni Shrine, is not a public site, it's a private site. It's run by a private interest group. It gets used by government officials which immediately makes it a huge problem. It's hugely controversial in Japan. But the most sort of the easiest answer is things change over time. It's been almost 80 years. This memory thing has evolved. That's why I wrote the book I did. And you are right, it's nationalistic today. It's not unnationalistic in this country. Look at our museums, many of them. 1995, I mean, plenty of examples. And yes, in the 90s, everything changed. Things were always known in Japan. Question is when it's necessary to make a big public move. The Germans never had the kind of leeway that the Japanese did. They were always forced by their neighbors, by Israel being an American ally, to say something useful about the war, and especially about the Holocaust. And German historians have done very good work on that. And German public historians have taken it on with a vengeance as something that they could contribute something to. The Japanese have not done that. There are many, many reasons for that. But it's not that they are ignorant. They certainly are not. You look at Japanese historians, you read their work. Not everything has been translated into English for our convenience. They were the ones who changed, who made all the textbook changes in the 90s. And yes, sexual slavery was everywhere. And then the right wing came in, whoosh, in the late 90s. And then it became a huge problem that became kind of one hook for a conservative political change on all fronts. Memory was just a tiny part of that. But that memory piece became the way in which conservative government changes and constitutional changes could be addressed. Because Japan didn't look very good anymore. That had everything to do with the change of the late 80s, early 90s. Japan never had to say any of those things because it was the #1 country in Asia. That changed in the late 80s, early 90s. And all of a sudden, the Chinese had a voice. And the South Koreans, oh my God, did they have a voice. But it was not until change in those countries happened that any progress was made on a transnational public view. Japanese inside Japan had always had these discussions. There was a certain way in which it wasn't kosher to really talk about the emperor as a war criminal while he was alive and while he was dying. But you know what? He died on December 7th, and on December 8th, the bookstores opened and a floodgate of already published books were suddenly apparent. So they hadn't been written overnight, but they waited until he was dead before all, Hirohito as war criminal and all of these studies came out. So they had been prepared for a long time. The comfort women thing was not a new thing. The first studies of this appeared in the early 70s. In the early 70s, during the Vietnam War, that was the context in which Japanese journalists went to Vietnam and then had the bright idea, I wonder what we did in China, and then did that research. So all of that had to do with geopolitics and with the geopolitical context of it. It's very complicated, and I said I can talk about this for the next 2 days, but maybe it gave you a little bit of a sense that this is just so much more complicated. And, I did start my career with that question because, I was a senior in 89, 90, or junior, at Berkeley, and when the wall fell and Tiananmen happened and the emperor had just died, all of this came together. And everybody wanted to know how Japanese memory compared to German memory. And in Germany, of course, you had now inherited the Stasi past, on top of the Nazi past, so memory was all over the place. And in Japan, that was the beginning of the comfort women controversy. All of a sudden, everybody was, well, why don't we know? That's not because nobody ever talked about it in Japan. We didn't talk about it. So, I applied to graduate schools, and everybody wanted me because I had Japanese and I had German, and they wanted that comparison. And then I ended up not doing the comparison. I wrote my book with a comparative mind. But just even observing myself, I went to Japan as a graduate student doing the research, and I would, kind of do the German type of thing. Well, anniversaries, they will be covered in the main newspapers, and then they weren't. And I'm like, I guess they really don't remember, until I realized that this is in different places. So, it's a very rich topic. And I am now in my research returning to Germany, but on my terms, and it's not a national. You cannot compare two nations and their memories. It just doesn't work. So I'm doing it on the Allied ways of convicting war criminals and putting them in prison. That's a pretty small thing that gives me comparative insights on one aspect, not on the whole thing. But I have gone over time, I'm sorry.
It's okay, next is a break, so we're all right. Thank you so much.